What is good, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the 1981 album by Rick James, Street Songs. Now this is his fifth album, and it basically contains one of his largest songs, which is Super Freak. It has a series of hits on there besides that. And I wanted to see what's up with Rick James, just because rap singers, rappers, they sample him often enough. I've heard a number of his songs on the radio in the past, at least Mary Jane and Super Freak and some of those. I just kind of wondered to take a look into some of these and see what the hubbub's kind of about. And I just kind of think, that's kind of the concept about it. He was a big hit singer in the early 80s and 70s and probably the mid 80s also, or further. But I wanted to see what he was up to, just to see some of the signature stuff that helped kick off like a lot of rap albums in the 80s, like Slick Rick and some of those type folks, Run DMC and Public Enemy and some of them. He was one of the originators, and like apart from like folks like Marvin Gaye and folks like that, there really weren't too many folks. I definitely have to give this album credit just because of the sheer star power and firepower of like Super Freak. That's really one of the best kind of 80s up tempo R&B songs that I have heard. Now he didn't rap. Rick James is not a rapper, but I would have to say that this is a quite quick paced song, Super Freak, and I also give credit to Give It To Me Baby also, as far as being two nice kind of jivey kind of bops, which is surprising because a lot of the music from like R&B and soul in the 70s, 60s even, and early 80s was kind of more down tempo, just kind of sluggish kind of music in a lot of ways, and that just kind of happens. I'm glad that Rick James had some jive to him, and especially that this is a particular kind of sound. Now I noticed that this album has like a still kind of leftover 70s feel, like the 70s is not quite over in like I think the mind of Rick James as far as this project kind of goes, because it is kind of like electronic, or it is kind of electro soul in a lot of ways, but it also has some funk in there. You will notice like tinges of funk and that type stuff, really kind of the stuff that like the Commodores and folks like that kind of did back in the day. And I just kind of look after the concept that it's just kind of like a blend. I feel like this is kind of like a genesis of a project, just because it kind of was responsible for kicking off a lot of the stuff that would go on to happen throughout the 80s. I want to start to discover some more of these projects, just to kind of see which ones were like the footholds and which ones were like the trailblazers and that type of stuff. So I definitely, you have to give Rick James credit on this particular project. It's chock full of hits, especially for days before CDs came out, when there was just records where you only had like 8, 7, 8, 9 songs, and you had to flip the record and play it and that type of stuff. It's just a different kind of concept. This is about the closest thing. I would definitely say that this was a hit album for 1981. I mean, I think like, well, we'll go ahead and get to the complaints, as we'll get to like the judgment of it as I start to review this more. But there is some quality stuff on here. So the first single is Give It To Me Baby, and this is a real kind of bouncy kind of song. Maybe not as crazy and carnivorous as Super Freak, but I definitely give it credit for having like a nice kickoff to the album. This is kind of like one that I recommend being played more. I think most folks in radio stations nowadays, just out of retrospect for retroness and respect for Rick James, will just always play Super Freak. But I think Give It To Me Baby deserves some extra credit also, just because this is a quality hit, and it's pretty much the second most powerful song on this album. I just really feel like it just has a lot of electronic kind of bounce on here. This is definitely more disco electronic. This kind of has that same kind of glittery, sparkly kind of feel towards it. And I just would have to say the hook is pretty stellar. Maybe not as crazily addictive as Super Freak, but it definitely competes with it. I think that this is a quality hit and kind of overlooked overall. I just would have to say this is definitely one that I think if you at least know 3 or 4 or 5 songs by Rick James, this should be one of those 5, and this is definitely one to kind of bolster it even further, to say, to give him more credit as far as that's kind of concerned. Just don't come to this album thinking that Super Freak's the only good song, because there is another one that just has the quality in that. So I definitely like this song quite a bit. It's a real sparkly kind of song. The second single is Super Freak, And this one basically is probably the one that most folks have heard, especially if you're not Rick James or people, baby boomers or Gen X's age that remember the song from back in the day. Funny story about this song, I just looked up some information about Rick James. Rick James tried to get the Super Freak music video to come out right on the debut of MTV back in the late summer of 1981. But MTV refused to play it just because they thought it was too vulgar and racy. So that's kind of the concept. But Rick James kind of got mad about that and said, well, how is it okay for like Madonna and Michael Jackson and Prince to be able to have those type of videos? But it's just kind of the concept. I get the feeling, I can just tell by the name of the song, that if Super Freak had been on MTV, it probably would have been a crazy time, just because I can tell that the music video probably would have been nuts, just because of the sheer velocity of the song. This is definitely one of the most electric songs of the 80s, I would have to say, even today. This is a highlight that you can still hear on the radio today. It has an addictive beat, and you probably heard it in one way or the other. Stuff like, MC Hammer's Can't Touch This sampled this song, and there's been other songs that have done it. I mean, it's just a classic kind of referred back to song. It's just an overall highlight, not just in R&B, rap, and soul music from the 80s, but also just in music in general. This is one of the most definitive and kind of, even though it didn't hit number one, this is one of the most outstanding songs of the 80s, and just has that same kind of telltale kind of um, what's the word I'm looking for? It has the same kind of timeless kind of feel about it. So it's just kind of the concept. It's just a highlight, definitely worth purchasing. In my opinion, I feel like Give It To Me Baby and Super Freak are an excellent 1-2 punch. Both of these are very jivey, kind of disco, well, Super Freak isn't disco, but this have a real contemporary and kind of bouncy kind of feel towards it, that just are not that are kind of unlike a lot of stuff, like I said, from like the 80s in terms of what else was going on. It's just Rick James is kind of like the old dirty bastard of the 80s. He was just a sheer party animal, had these hits, even though there weren't a factory made amount of them, just because albums were shorter back then. I still have to say that these two hits were just excellent 1-2 punch, and just good, made this album really pack a punch. So the third single is Ghetto Life, and basically this song rounds out the singles of the project. This one is kind of more like, this one feels like more of a street single compared to like Super Freak really aiming for commercial radio, and Give It To Me Baby kind of being more of like the more contemporary rhythmic radio kind of one. I feel like Ghetto Life is a good way of rounding out the project. I mean, originally there were only 3 singles. Fire and Desire came out later, but Ghetto Life definitely has like a good bop to it. This one's definitely kind of like another dance club bop, but it just has more of a 70s feel towards it. This one's just more funk, I just would have to say. It's not quite as disco as and electronic as Give It To Me Baby, and it just doesn't have the overall sheer pace as Super Freak, but it is like, it is kind of, it's a jivey song, but it is kind of more 70s induced. And just because I think back in 1980, 1981, they didn't realize that some of the trends from the 70s were not going to make it forward. That's just kind of the concept, where this one, if you do like the stuff that Rick James did from the 70s and you like the overall 70s sound, this is a single for that. But in my opinion, I kind of give it like an almost song. I just would have to say I like the concept of it, but it kind of, I do like Rick James trying to break out into like sheer commercial kind of vibes with like the 2 songs he did with Give It To Me Baby and Super Freak. And this one kind of feels kind of more of like a street single, that this is kind of, I mean, it works as like a good song. It works as like a good song, but I don't think it has like as much of like the commercial star power as like the first 2 singles. That's kind of the concept about it. But I do think it's a good way of rounding out the singles. I would like to hear this in like a dance club and those type places. It just would probably take a lot of folks. I bet a lot of folks would probably think this came out in the 70s just based upon the production of it. This really happens to kind of be a thing, but it does have a nice bounce towards it. The 4th single is Fire and Desire, and this is a duet with Tina Marie. Didn't really like this song, was kind of lengthy, it was 7 minutes. It's just kind of like, I feel like the 2 songs on here, like Make Love to Me and Fire and Desire, kind of the more down-tempo, Barry White, Marvin Gaye, and those type songs, is kind of more of like the love making and kind of slow bedroom boom type numbers that just kind of happen to happen. But I just would have to say, I mean, Rick James kind of flipped the script. I mean, he could do up tempo, down tempo songs, but I really didn't vibe that much with like the down tempo ones because these down tempo songs just didn't quite connect with me as well as like the up tempo ones. I just feel like they don't have the same spark in my opinion. But I would have to say to talk about the album now. I'm gonna go ahead and recommend the 4 songs out of 8 I recommend to you. So those 4 songs would be "Give It to Me, Baby," "Super Freak." The only other song I recommend actually would be "Call Me Up," and "Ghetto Life" is the almost song. So "Call Me Up" is another kind of disco. Call Me Up is kind of a solid album cut, but it is kind of another funk type song. I was kind of looking for more songs from Rick James like Give It to Me Baby or especially Super Freak. Now this is a funk song that just has an overall nice tempo. This is kind of turned down, or this one's just kind of like a regular mid-tempo kind of dance club bop. I do feel like at least in that sense, at least in a 70s kind of clubs, not quite contemporary enough. I feel like it's relatively contemporary, but it's kind of still a little bit retro, as in kind of more 70s sound than what was kind of sprawling and happening in the 80s and such. And I would have to say, like, I do feel like "Give It to Me, Baby" was definitely the most contemporary song next to "Super Freak," of course. But those 2 songs, I was kind of looking for Rick James to kind of round out the album with some more kind of glittery hits that could have had a lot more sparkling kind of the sound that would later go on to encompass the 80s that folks would later do, especially in like rhythmic and soul music and that type of stuff. I mean, Rick James kind of had like the baton in this sense as far as carrying the grounds to shape out the sound. He was definitely one of the trailblazers that did it, but it kind of felt like he just didn't have enough aims to really do it. I was looking for more songs. I mean, I know Super Freak was kind of like a flash in the pan in a lot of ways. Maybe not in terms of Rick James' overall career, but at least that one was like the true highlight. And "Give It to Me, Baby" is like an excellent kind of song, but there just weren't enough songs like those 2 songs. I mean, this album kind of has more down tempo songs. Just to talk about some of the complaints, like I really felt like "Below the Funk" was just too quick a song, and I didn't really like the kind. I mean, this is another funky song that I just didn't really like the pace of, and just was happening too quickly, and just didn't have enough like encompassment to really warrant how quick this. I mean, that one was just too high tempo or too up tempo a song, and "Fire and Desire" was too lengthy, and I didn't really like the kind of sluggish, kind of down tempo vibes. Same thing with "Make Love to Me." That one was kind of a sluggish song that just was kind of, um, yeah, I just would have to say that "Fire and Desire" and "Make Love to Me" were just kind of sluggish down tempo songs I just didn't really appreciate the vibe of. I mean, they do have a facilitated necessity for what they are, just depending upon if you're just in a different kind of mode and mood for what's going on with like the R&B and soul type music. But I really felt like Rick James just kind of undervalued and kind of undermined his own success by not cracking forth with the desire to to replicate Super Freak and "Give It to Me, Baby." So that's just kind of the concept. And then "Mr. Policeman" was just an overall awkward song. This one was just kind of an odd one. Didn't really have much of a jive towards it. I know Rick James has had problems and run-ins with the law, but it just kind of felt odd to designate a whole song to that concept. That just really happens to be a thing. So this is kind of, I mean, this is a good album. It represents a lot. It's a trailblazer of a project, and it did a lot for the 80s and further. But I kind of look after it. This is kind of underwhelming just because I look over the concept and just have to say that it just did not represent the essence of what it probably could have. Maybe Rick James at the time didn't realize that Super Freak was going to be that massive a hit, but it really didn't have like the backup qualities to really it didn't have the backup qualities to really pump these out. I don't know if like Rick James's 1982, 1983 albums wound up having more hits like this, but it's one of those situations. It's just a classic kind of concept where a singer will get like a hit song, but then will not do other songs like it, and as a result, it kind of damns them and sabotages their success. And that's just kind of the concept. Now, I don't think Rick James was wholesomely damaged by this, and he did get further hits later. And it's just kind of the concept that it was an awkward time just because the 70s were ending, the 80s were kicking off, sounds were changing like they always do. But I look after it, it's more just my appetite for seeing the quality of "Give It to Me, Baby" and that kind of overall glossy feel, and then not getting it, and kind of being more reliant on previous trends and trying to do that as opposed to being more of like a risk taker. And it's not, I don't want to say risk taker like he isn't brave enough to do it, but it's kind of the concept that it just is kind of didn't really forge ahead. That is kind of the concept. So that's just the thing. But Super Freak, Give It To Me Baby are outstanding. Ghetto Life is a nice almost song. This is one that just because it's an almost song doesn't mean I won't listen to it and don't recommend it, but it just kind of has that more street single kind of feel towards Ghetto Life just kind of has that more street single type feel towards it, and it just doesn't quite aim as highly commercial as like what it might have. And then I just would have to say like Call Me Up is another funk type song that has a real highlighted dance club kind of vibe and just a 70s sense. That's just kind of the concept. So I just would have to say me liking at least 3.5 songs out of 8. I'm gonna go ahead and give this album like a 5.25 out of 10. I think that that's more than enough to just be able to say that that's quality on here. Definitely a highlight of the early 80s, and it probably would have gotten a higher score just based upon the concept of what it did for the time. But I just look after it, the fact that there's only 8 songs and that I have so many complaints about it. I mean, it was probably it would get a higher score if it was like 1993 or 1986 or something. Probably get like an 8 or something. But years later, decades later, for over 40 years later, it's kind of like it just has. I mean, you have to just. I mean, I realize that it's an old album. That's how things were 40 years ago. But it's just kind of. I mean, the test of time. It just is like you just. There's so many things that you can say about these situations nowadays that just kind of happens to more be the concept. But that's the thing about a lot of albums. That's Back in Black. That's Back in Black by AC/DC. That's Metallica's Master of Puppets. Some of those type records. Even like Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions. I mean, there's just so many of these albums that just had like 7, 8 songs. Even like probably Prince albums, stuff like that. There's just relative things about some of these that when you don't like 2, 3, or 4 songs out of 8 or 9 songs on a project, it kind of sabotages the score. That's just how I would review things now. It's just kind of, you have to wonder if you're going to adjust the scores due to the age of the time period that they were in. And that's how I saw it in terms of the quality. But so 5.25 score. Now the social score I'll give a 7.25 just because the singles, all 3 out of 4 of the singles, Super Freak, Ghetto Life, and Give It To Me Baby, all have like a particular jivey feel about them, and they're very contemporary and up tempo. They make you want to dance and get up, shake your ass, and kind of have a good time, and just overall get crunk and that sort of stuff. And especially for that time, it was revolutionary. That's just kind of the concept. So I give the social score a little bit higher because it is kind of jivey and that type stuff. But it's just short, and it does have 3 contemporary singles, but yeah, this kind of lacks some album cuts on here. That's like the main thing. So in terms of the future, well, there's not really a future just because Rick James is deceased and has been for 18, 19 years now. This is kind of the concept. But I do want to, of course, say that there are some quality hits on this project. It is worth picking up, and I'm probably going to review some more Rick James at some point. I'll have to see which ones have some more of his hits on there just to kind of mess with it. But 5.25 out of 10 score, 7.25 social. There is some stuff on here.